so principal component analysis. So the kind of problem that PCA tries to solve is it tries to do dimension reduction that minimizes the reconstruction error. Or another way of framing this is that you're doing dimension reduction in a way that maximizes the variance or variability of your data. So kind of toy example here is, let's imagine that you have an xy plane. So you have these points on the x-axis and the y-axis. And let's say that these are some of the coordinates. So you can see that it's just kind of these points along this line. And so the kind of idea of this is that you can, instead of having these two numbers, which have these kind of patterns that you notice that the second number is the second, or multiplied by 2 of the first number. So instead, what you might do is you just might store the first number and keep this relationship that the second number is just 2 times that. So what you can do here is, instead of storing both those numbers, you'll just store the first number and this relationship, and that will allow you to reduce down to only storing one number and this relationship. And so in that way, you've saved yourself about half the space you would use to store both the numbers. And so in that kind of scenario, we had something that kind of perfectly fit the data. So now let's imagine something that doesn't exactly fall on a diagonal line. So now we have these xy points again, and we want to fit some sort of line to that. So we'll fit this first line to it. And then the second line would be the diagonal of that. And so these actually correspond to the principal components. And so what a lot of people like to do is to rotate these. And so now you'll notice that along this blue line that we drew first, we have a lot of variation, and there's a lot of space between the 2 points. But if we look on the other axis, there isn't a lot of space, and you notice that there's much less than along this blue line. And that's why the blue line represents the first principal component, and the black line represents or axis represents the second principal component. And so if you imagine, in the case of dimensionality reduction, we don't want to store all the points. So if you imagine we just use this blue line and we don't use this vertical axis or these black lines, we still lose some information, but we capture most of the variability in these points. And so again, to kind of reiterate, the principal components, or PCs, can be thought of these vectors or lines. And the PC scores, or also sometimes called the projections, can be thought of the coordinates that they have on these lines, or these principal components. And so some properties of PCA that I want to highlight here are that the PCAs are orthogonal, or also independent, or perpendicular. And these are all synonyms for each other. And some kind of intuition for that is that if you're trying to maximize the amount of information you have on a single axis, you don't want there to be shared information in between these axes. So therefore, you might want them to be independent and not really carry information from the other. And another property is that the PCs are ordered by the amount of variance or information they can explain. So in our example earlier, the first PC contained more variability or information than the second PC. And there are more properties of PCA than just these two, but these are the two that we're going to highlight here. And so PCA is not without limitations. So one thing that PCA is sensitive to is scaling. So if you imagine that you have 2 measurements, such as like a shoe size and a weight, the weight can take much larger values and have much more ranges than a shoe size. And therefore, the PCA might actually pick up on these larger values and tell you that this is actually more important. But in reality, it could be the other way. But one way to kind of combat this is to do standardization. So another limitation of PCA is that it assumes linear relationships. So in all these kinds of examples, we've been drawing lines to kind of fit to the data. But your data may not always be well characterized by many lines. So if you imagine that you have a data that is on a XY plane that's arranged in a circle, you can't really characterize this well by a small amount of lines. And another point I'd like to bring up is that you can have interpretation issues with PCA. So with PCA, we're often assuming that the signal that's extracted from the first few PCs is often meaningful, and that this variance actually means something by extracting these strong signals. But the other thing is that PCA can fit noise. So if there was no signal to really observe in the first place, the PCA will still kind of pick things up, and we might interpret that as something meaningful when it's not.